The soil on my father's grave was still dark and damp when the crowd began to thin, but the coldness settling in my chest had nothing to do with the winter air. My name is Ethan. I am 28 years old, an age where a man is supposed to be standing firmly on his own 2 feet, yet there I was, feeling like an orphan boy lost in a fog. My father, Marcus, had been my anchor, a quiet, hard-working man who built a modest trucking business from nothing but grease and grit. When cancer stole his breath, it felt like the foundation of my world had been ripped away. As the final mourners offered their rehearsed condolences and walked back to their cars, I stayed behind, staring at the fresh mound of earth. The silence of the cemetery was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of gravel behind me. It was Evelyn, the private hospice nurse who had cared for my father during his final 3 months at our family home. She wasn't wearing her scrubs today. Instead, she wore a simple black coat, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit gates. She stopped a few feet away, her gloved hands trembling as she clutched a small leather-bound notebook against her chest. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "They're all going back to the wake at your uncle's place. You need to go back to your father's house instead. Right now." I frowned, wiping a stray tear from my cheek. "Evelyn, the house is locked. There's nothing there but empty rooms and shadows. I can't face that right now." She stepped closer, her breath pluming in the freezing air, and looked over her shoulder before locking her eyes onto mine. "You don't understand." He knew what they were planning. He couldn't speak at the end, but he made me swear. "She's waiting for you inside that empty house, Ethan. Go through the basement door. Do not let your uncle see you go." Before I could ask a single question, Evelyn pressed a rusted brass key into my palm, turned on her heel, and walked briskly toward the parking lot, leaving me standing alone in the deafening silence of the graveyard. To understand the dread that began to crawl up my spine, you have to understand what my life looked like before the machines in my father's bedroom started ticking away his final hours. For 28 years, our house on Oak Ridge Lane was a sanctuary of routine. My mother had passed away when I was just a toddler, leaving my father, Marcus, to raise me alone. He was a man of few words, but his love was heavy and tangible, found in the way he packed my school lunches with extra snacks, or how he spent his weekends teaching me how to fix engines in our garage. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Dad's business, Marcus and Son Transport, was thriving enough that he had recently taken on his younger brother, my uncle Julian, as a business partner to handle the accounts. Julian was everything my father wasn't: charismatic, sharp-dressed, and always talking about expansion and investments. I never quite trusted the slick way Julian smiled, or the way his wife, Clara, looked around our modest living room with a thin veil of disgust. But Dad believed in family. "Blood doesn't betray blood, Ethan," he would tell me, wiping motor oil from his brow as we shared a quiet dinner of roast beef and mashed potatoes at the kitchen table. That table was the heart of our home. It was weathered, scratched by years of dropped tools and heavy mugs, smelling faintly of pine cleaner and wood smoke. We were just two men living a simple life, rooted in honesty. But when Dad's diagnosis came down like a hammer last winter, Uncle Julian and Aunt Clara suddenly became very fixture-like in our home, floating through the hallways like vultures waiting for the fire to go out. The first real seed of suspicion wasn't planted by a loud argument, but by the quiet click of a briefcase. It happened about 3 weeks before Dad passed. He had lost his ability to speak clearly, his voice reduced to a raspy whisper, and he spent most of his days drifting in and out of consciousness in the hospital bed we set up in the downstairs den. Evelyn, the nurse, was a godsend, always gentle, checking his vitals, and ensuring his dignity remained intact. One evening, around twilight, I walked down the hallway carrying a tray of tea for Evelyn. As I approached the den, I noticed the door was cracked open, casting a narrow sliver of yellow light across the hardwood floor. I stopped when I heard Uncle Julian's voice. It wasn't the soft, greeting tone he used when I was in the room. It was sharp, urgent, and cold. "Just press your thumb here, Marcus. Don't make this difficult. It's for the boy's sake. You want Ethan taken care of, don't you?" Julian was saying. I peeked through the crack. Julian was leaning over my father's frail body, holding a stack of legal documents. My father was shaking his head weakly, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury, his thin hand trying to push Julian away. Aunt Clara stood by the window, her arms crossed, her eyes cold as ice as she kept watch. "Hurry up, Julian," Clara hissed under her breath. "The nurse is upstairs fetching fresh linens, and the boy will be back from the hardware store soon." My heart hammered against my ribs. I stumbled backward, the teacups rattling on the tray. Before I could think, I deliberately slammed my foot against the baseboard to make noise. Instantly, the shifting of papers inside the room stopped. When I pushed the door open, Julian was smoothly tucking a folder into his leather briefcase, a tight, artificial smile plastered across his face. "Ah, Ethan. Just checking on your old man, Julian said, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt entirely too heavy. He's resting now. We should let him sleep. They left shortly after, but when I knelt beside Dad's bed, his frail fingers gripped my wrist with surprising strength. He stared at me, his eyes swimming with tears, his lips moving soundlessly. He pointed a trembling finger toward the floor, not just at the ground, but toward the basement beneath us. I tried to comfort him, telling him he was safe, but the terror in his eyes haunted me for the rest of the night. I knew then that, family or not, a snake had entered our home. The drive from the cemetery back to Oak Ridge Lane felt like a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Evelyn's words echoed in my mind, competing with the heavy memory of my father's terrified face pointing toward the basement. Instead of pulling into the main driveway where Uncle Julian's black SUV would normally be parked, I left my car a block away and walked through the overgrown alleyway behind our property. The air smelled of impending snow and damp earth. I slipped through the back gate, my eyes scanning the windows of the silent, dark house. It looked abandoned, a hollow shell of the warmth it once held. I made my way to the old wooden storm doors that led straight into the basement. My hands shook as I pulled out the rusted brass key Evelyn had given me. I slotted it into the heavy padlock, twisted it, and felt a dull click. The padlock snapped open. As I pulled the heavy wooden doors upward, a musty smell of old wood, motor oil, and dry earth hit me. I stepped down into the darkness, shutting the doors behind me, plunging myself into near-total blackness until I clicked on the small flashlight on my phone. The beam of light danced across old storage boxes, my dad's old fishing rods, and stacks of spare truck tires. The house above me was completely silent. Or so I thought. I crept up the creaking wooden basement stairs that led into the kitchen. As I reached the top landing, the door was slightly ajar. I held my breath, listening. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound drifted from the living room, the sound of someone typing on a laptop, followed by the distinct rustle of heavy paper. My heart hammered against my ribs. Someone was in the house. Pushing the door open an inch, I peered through the gap. Sitting at our old kitchen table, under the dim light of the single overhead bulb, was Clara. She wasn't crying. She wasn't mourning. She was surrounded by neat stacks of legal folders, my father's business ledgers, and a portable document scanner. She was systematically scanning every single title deed and bank statement my father owned. On the table next to her sat a stamp pad and a specialized notary seal. "Where is the offshore routing number, Julian?" Clara muttered impatiently into her phone, which was propped up on her shoulder. "I've gone through his entire desk. If we don't file the transfer deed before the probate court opens on Monday, the boy's lawyers will start digging. Marcus is in the ground now, we don't have time to waste." Hearing her speak about my father so callously, just an hour after we covered him in dirt, sent a surge of hot rage through my veins. I wanted to burst through the door, to rip the papers from her hands, to scream at her for violating our home. But my father's voice whispered in my mind, "Be smart, Ethan." I lowered my phone and started recording a video through the crack of the door. "Julian, listen to me," Clara continued, her voice sharp and transactional. "The forged power of attorney went through because the bank teller didn't question Marcus's signature. But we need the physical title certificates for the fleet trucks to finalize the sale to the logistics firm. If Ethan finds out we emptied the business accounts before the funeral, he'll cause a scene." She paused, listening to Julian on the other end, then let out a cold, mocking laugh. "The boy? Please. Ethan is completely broken. He's sitting at your brother's wake right now, crying into his drink. He doesn't have a clue that by next week, this house and the entire transport company will belong to us. Just get back here with the remaining corporate seals." My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the phone. It wasn't just a sudden financial dispute, it was a calculated, cold-blooded execution of a plot to strip me of everything my father had built for my future. They had used my father's dying days, his inability to speak, to steal his life's work right under my nose. I stopped the recording and quietly backed down the basement stairs, my mind racing. Confronting Clara right now would only make her hide the evidence. I needed to catch them completely exposed, where their slick lies couldn't save them. Dad had always taught me that when an engine is failing, you don't just patch the leak, you pull out the problem by its roots. I stepped back out into the freezing winter air, the brass key heavy in my pocket, and a cold, sharp resolve settling over my grief. I didn't go to my uncle's house to confront them in a screaming match. I knew exactly where Julian would be heading next. He wouldn't go straight back to the empty house on Oak Ridge Lane while his wife was still organizing the paperwork. He had to maintain appearances at the formal wake to ensure the family and the remaining business associates saw him as the grieving, supportive brother. I drove straight to the Grand Horizon Banquet Hall, where 50 of my father's closest friends, drivers, and local business owners were gathered. When I walked through the double doors, the room fell into a respectful hush. The smell of catered roasted chicken and stale coffee hung heavy in the air. People looked at me with pitying eyes, nodding softly. And there, standing near the buffet line with a glass of whiskey in his hand, was Uncle Julian. He was surrounded by 3 of our oldest fleet drivers, men who had worked with my father for over 20 years. Julian was wiping a fake tear from his eye, shaking his head. "It's a tragedy," Julian was saying, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Marcus was a great man. But honestly, toward the end, his mind was completely gone. He was signing things he didn't understand, mismanaging the payroll. "It's a miracle Clara and I stepped in when we did to keep the trucks moving. I'm just worried about Ethan. The boy simply isn't cut out for the stress of the transport business. He's fragile." Hearing him paint my father as incompetent and me as a helpless child in front of the very community that respected us made my blood run cold. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staggering. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my black suit jacket, and walked straight toward the group. "Uncle Julian," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the immediate circle. Julian turned, his face instantly shifting into an expression of deep, exaggerated sympathy. "Ethan! My boy. We were wondering where you went. You shouldn't be alone right now. Come, sit down, let me get you a plate." "I was at the house, Julian," I said, deliberately omitting the word uncle. A subtle twitch caught the corner of Julian's left eye. His grip on his whiskey glass tightened. "The house? Why would you go there? Everything is locked up tight. We agreed we'd handle the property matters together next month." "I went to get a few of Dad's personal journals," I replied, keeping my expression entirely neutral, acting the part of the grieving, naive son. "But I found Clara there. She was working very hard at the kitchen table. She seemed to be scanning a lot of Dad's corporate seals and deeds. She mentioned something on the phone about a forged power of attorney and transferring the fleet before Monday morning." The color drained from Julian's face so fast it looked as if he had seen a ghost. The 3 fleet drivers looked at each other, their expressions turning from sorrow to sharp confusion. "Ethan, you're clearly exhausted, you're imagining things," Julian stammered, lowering his voice and stepping closer to grab my arm. "Clara is at home resting. Let's step outside and talk about this privately. You're causing a scene." "I'm not imagining anything, Julian," I said, stepping back so his hand missed my shoulder. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. In fact, I wanted to make sure I didn't forget a single word she said. I turned the volume up to maximum and pressed play on the recording. Clara's sharp, transactional voice cut through the murmurs of the banquet hall. The forged power of attorney went through because the bank teller didn't question Marcus's signature. Marcus is in the ground now, we don't have time to waste. The room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the ice rattling in Julian's trembling glass. The silence in the banquet hall was deafening. It was the kind of stillness that pinches the lungs, where the only movement was the slow, rhythmic dripping of melting ice from Julian's glass onto the polished linoleum floor. The 50 people in that room, men who had bled for my father's business, neighbors who had known me since I was a boy in short pants, stared at Julian with an expression that shifted rapidly from confusion to pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian's face went through an entire spectrum of terror. The charming, slick businessman melted away, leaving a desperate, cornered animal. This is a setup," he sputtered, his voice cracking as he looked around the room for an ally. "The boy is distraught. He's grieving. You can't trust a doctored audio clip." "That is Clara's voice, Julian," said Frank, our oldest fleet driver, stepping forward. Frank was a mountain of a man, his hands calloused from 30 years of gripping steering wheels. He looked at Julian as if he were a grease stain on a clean windshield. "I've listened to that woman complain about Marcus's business for 10 years. I know her voice anywhere. You stole from Marcus while he was gasping for his last breaths?" "Frank, please, it's a corporate misunderstanding," Julian pleaded, backing up until his spine hit the edge of the buffet table. "It's over, Julian," I said, my voice shockingly calm. There was no need to scream. The truth has a weight of its own, it doesn't need to be shouted to crush a lie. The police have already been called to Oak Ridge Lane. A patrol car is pulling into the driveway right now to find Clara with the forged notary stamps and the stolen deeds. And as for you, you won't be stepping foot inside Marcus and Son Transport ever again." Julian looked around the room, realizing that the network of respect he had tried to hijack was entirely built on my father's integrity, not his own. Seeing the absolute wall of cold shoulders from the drivers and associates, he dropped his glass. It shattered against the floor, spilling amber liquid across the white tile. Without another word, he turned and bolted through the side exit into the freezing night, entirely broke, entirely exposed. The legal fallout was swift and merciless, but handled with the quiet dignity my father always maintained. The police caught Clara exactly where I left her, frantically stuffing my father's land titles into her leather briefcase while a patrol car's red and blue lights painted the kitchen walls. Because I had the video evidence, the bank records, and the testimony of Evelyn, the hospice nurse who came forward with my dad's personal logbook, the state prosecutor didn't hesitate. Julian and Clara were charged with grand theft, forgery, and financial exploitation of the elderly. To avoid a lengthy, public trial that would completely ruin what was left of their reputation, they pled guilty. The court stripped them of every corporate right, forced the return of every stolen dollar from the business accounts, and sentenced them both to state prison. But the real punishment wasn't the prison cell. It was the public consequence. The community they so desperately wanted to lord over completely erased them. Their names became synonymous with betrayal in our town. Nobody bought from them, nobody spoke to them, and when their children tried to pick up the pieces, they had to move 2 states away just to escape the shadow of their parents' greed. Justice wasn't delivered with an axe, it was delivered with a pen and a camera, exactly how a modern man protects his legacy. 6 months have passed since that freezing afternoon in the cemetery, and the grass has finally grown over my father's grave. The dark, heavy mud has been replaced by a blanket of soft green, vibrant and full of life. I still sit at our old kitchen table every evening, drinking my coffee from the same heavy mugs my dad used. The scratches on the wood are still there, but they don't look like scars anymore, they look like memories. With Julian and Clara out of the business, the drivers and I worked double shifts to rebuild what was compromised. We didn't just survive, we thrived. The fleet is back on the road, the engines roaring with the same steady, honest rhythm my father gave his life to maintain. Evelyn still checks in on me from time to time, a quiet guardian angel who reminded me that even in the darkest hours, there are people who will stand up for what is right. I learned that true strength doesn't come from anger, nor does revenge require cruelty. It comes from keeping your head clear when your heart is breaking, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting for you. I am 28 years old, and I finally feel like the man my father always knew I could be. I kept his name clean, I kept his trucks rolling, and I kept his legacy alive. ##### A final reflection from Dad Revenge CR7. My dear friends, as we sit here together at the end of this journey, I can't help but look at my own hands and think about the people we let into our homes. We often guard our front doors with heavy locks and alarms, completely blind to the fact that the real danger might already be sitting at our dinner table, smiling, waiting for us to blink. It takes a special kind of pain to realize that the blood in your veins doesn't guarantee the loyalty in someone's heart. But Ethan's story reminds us that justice doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the biggest bully, it belongs to the patient soul who refuses to let a good man's legacy be erased in the dark. I want to thank you all for sitting with me today on Dad Revenge CR7. If this story touched your heart, or if it reminded you of the quiet strength we must carry for our elders, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Before I close the book on this chapter, I want to ask you one honest question, from my heart to yours. If you discovered that your own family was tearing down everything your parents built while you were drowning in grief, would you have stayed calm enough to catch them in the act, or would you have let the anger take over? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and look after the ones who truly love you.